So this is a video that I've intended to make for some time now, but a number of other things, topical issues came up that I felt were worth talking about. A few things I want to say before I begin. Firstly, this is not going to be a definitive video. Without doubt, there will be things that I feel that I could add to it. There will be things that I want to amend. There will be things that would warrant another video on the same topic. So it's not meant to be definitive, it's just meant to be as I am feeling about this subject at this particular time. Um, at this point, I am not a member of any political party, and I haven't been for, well, 7 years now. I was a member of the Liberal Democrats from 2005 to 2010 because I found myself feeling that they were broadly a centrist party that I felt I could connect to. And there were people in the party I greatly respected, people I do still respect, incidentally. Um, it was under Charles Kennedy's leadership that I joined the party, and I was active in them for 5 years. Stood for election twice, unsuccessfully, but I did triple my own result second time around. Not big level, just council level. Um, I'm pleased for the experience. It was good to have the experience, even though it was low level, of canvassing to know what the political world is about. But I'm not aligned to the Liberal Democrats anymore. The reason I left the party was there were multiple reasons. Back in 2010, I sort of had mixed views about the decision of Nick Clegg to go into coalition government. And this is purely talking from the Liberal Democrat perspective as I then was. Initially, I sort of gave him a 100-day trial. I thought, well, these men, by which I mean David Cameron as well, are putting the country before party. Now, that's something that I feel in the UK, we still haven't. That's really not a British thing. It's very normal in other parts of Europe, like in Germany, but in Britain, people are naturally cautious about it because they feel that people, when they're in a political party, they absolutely have to be diehard, um, always warring with the other side. It's something I don't really like about British politics, actually. This idea that if parties do reach out to another political party, if they do talk, then somehow that's selling on conviction. I'll come back to that in a bit. Anyway, I decided to give Nick Clegg a sort of trial period. At the time, I had very strong views about the way unemployed people were being treated. I still do. And I felt Nick Clegg had kind of pandered a little bit too much to the Tory side of things. I remember one speech he gave where he said someone had raised this issue about how claimants were being treated, and Clegg's response was, "I believe in work." Now, at the time, that angered a lot of people, including myself, because the insinuation was that if you make an issue out of anything to do with the welfare system, you're somehow anti-work. So I felt very angry at his attitude to that. In other areas, I think he got it right. I believe he was more level headed on certain issues than some of his predecessors had been. But anyway, I left the party for a range of reasons. I just found myself. The problem is when you're in a political party, you do sort of have to be tribal. You have to tie your colours to the mast, so to speak. Now, I've always had strong views on crime. And that was something I'd always been somewhat uneasy about with the Liberal Democrats, because they're a centre-left party. Their views on crime are not my views on crime. So being a member of the party, that was something that always made me uneasy, because I knew it went against my own way of thinking, which is frankly, pretty hard line. Um, that's not to say the Lib Dems are as irresponsible as, say, the Greens, but they are centre-left on these issues. So that was another thing that ultimately meant I just decided to leave. I decided not to renew my membership. Since then, I haven't aligned myself with any political party. When I vote, it tends to be on a number of factors. Yes, I do look at the individuals, but I also look at the direction the party is taking. Um, in my city, I voted Labour because I felt the council has done some good things. Um, Also, I've spoken to the local MP a few times. I think she's a decent MP. I probably wouldn't agree with all her positions, but I think she is a decent MP. So, because I know her and because I knew less about the other candidates, I gave her my vote. But this is not something that I don't think voting is something people should take lightly. It's almost a cliche, but voting is a civic responsibility. I mean, the point about a democracy, people complain about politics all the time, but they have to remember that whilst our democracy is flawed, at least we have a choice. There's parts of the world where there really is no choice. No choice. I know people say, oh, there's no choice here, none of the above, and so on. But the point is, you can make that protest. Last night I read about the former boxer Terry Marsh, who stood as a candidate, as an independent. He actually changed his name by deed poll to none of the above. My point is, we can do that if we want to. So if we want to say it's a whole big mess, we can say that. And sometimes I feel frustrated that I do think in the UK people spend far more time complaining about politics than actually considering how this compares to the international situation. And we have to put things in context. In the UK, we don't have violent transfers of power. You know, it's not like a conservative government replaces a Labour government and, there's bloody street battles between Labour and conservative supporters and vice versa. So I do think sometimes we need to bear that in mind. And where there is corruption, where there is bias, where there is all these problems, we can freely say that. I can make these videos. I can complain if I want to. We can write to government ministers. We can make protests. Now, you could say it doesn't make any difference, but I think we shouldn't take that for granted, the fact that we can do it. And that isn't even to say that we have a perfect civil liberty situation. There have been attempts by both Labour and Tory governments to rein in on certain civil liberties. That's something we can't take our eyes off the ball, so to speak, on those issues. Theresa May has come under particular criticism. Her government, I would say, just as much criticism as the Blair government for certain forms of surveillance. I've mixed views on that. I believe measures should be taken against terrorism, but it's a fine balancing point. So that's to give the context about my own situation. I am not currently affiliated to any party, so no one can pigeonhole me. No one can say, "Oh, Nathan, you're a Liberal Democrat." I'm not a Liberal Democrat, not now. They can't say I'm a socialist. They can't say I'm a conservative. I deliberately don't, associate myself with those things. I don't call myself a feminist. I don't call myself a masculist. Part of the reason is because when you name yourself a certain way, then inevitably people will criticize you for whatever that movement can be criticized for. So if you call yourself a feminist, you can't really complain when people criticize certain aspects of feminism. I mean, you could defend it, but my point is, if you're going to wear your heart on your sleeve, then that goes with the territory. Just like when you're a member of a political party, I mean, it is tribal. I found when I was in the Liberal Democrats, I naturally wanted to defend the party when they were criticized. It's normal. It's like you might argue with members of your family, but you'll still defend them. It's sort of the same principle. Um, what I really want to talk about is centrism and the position of centrism in the world today, in Britain and in the world. This is something that has been really, really tested in the last sort of 3 years, with Brexit especially, with the emergence of both the populist right and populist left, or at least anti-globalist left. The irony is Donald Trump and, let's say, Jeremy Corbyn have a lot more in common than they might want to admit, because both, maybe Corbyn's not even the best example, but okay, let's say Alexis Tsipras, both rail against the establishment, both claim media bias, both tap into disaffection, though in different ways. In the case of the populist right, it would be the idea that the liberal establishment are not listening, and that they're caving into political correctness and refugees coming before native people, etc. In the case of the left, it is this big overbearing globalist conspiracy to keep down the working class. It's basically classic red arguments. Um, so then I find it is the centre that end up being accused of being the liberal establishment. And there's this kind of lazy association with political centrism, liberal establishment. Like, it's exactly the same thing. Now, my username is Centrist Philosopher, and I chose that for a very specific reason. Now, it's slightly playful. I'm not a philosopher. I'm a thinker, but I'm not a professional philosopher. It's kind of playful. Centrist, well, this is something I've raised before. What I find is both the hard left and the hard right are quite tribal in their thinking. And that's not a criticism necessarily. You know, they have conviction, they believe in what they believe. But one of the biggest mistakes, one of the biggest misconceptions about people who are more to the centre is that we don't have conviction, that we don't have strong views. Also, as someone who sort of identifies as centrist, it's not an ideology in the same way as socialism or conservatism or liberalism or libertarianism is. It's more a broad positioning. For me, it's realpolitik in a way that the others are not, because with the others, it's far more tribal. With centrism, one of the appeals about centrism to me is it is less tribal, so there is more scope for being open-minded. Um, so, what do we associate with centrism? Who do we associate with centrism? Probably leaders like Bill Clinton, Tony Blair, Nick Clegg, in France, Francois Bayrou, and there's many other examples. Now, centrists themselves become very controversial figures. Tony Blair was and is a very controversial leader. I'm sure in the States Bill Clinton still is. But the thing about centrism, it's a recognition that number one, the Cold War is over. So positioning people as being on the rigid left or the rigid right, for me, is not appealing because people are not that simple. Sure, there will be people who are hardcore socialists, there are people who are hardcore conservatives, I get that. But there are a lot of people who actually have a centrist way of thinking, whether they would necessarily call themselves that or not. So, for example, I'll give a well known example. Piers Morgan is a public figure who is quite hard to pinpoint. He's a former tabloid editor. In the United States, he was castigated as a lefty because of his strong views on gun issues. And yet the same man has been very outspoken against feminism. So you can either really classify him as left or right because he's annoyed both sides. I kind of respect Piers Morgan for that, incidentally, because whatever you think of him, he does have a slightly arrogant streak. I would recognize that, but I think he is somebody who speaks his mind. That deserves respect. I mean, no one can accuse Piers Morgan of being politically correct. He does speak his mind. Um, but I think where there has been a backlash against centrism, there's been numerous reasons for this. In the Brexit debate, I think that one of the main Leave sort of arguments was that the Remain side, and I believe this is an unfair stereotype, but the Remain side was all liberal elitists who weren't living in the real world. Now, it is unfair because you can't talk about 16 million people, and you can't talk about all the political activists in that way. Chuka Umunna got angry about this because he said his constituency is one of the most deprived in the UK, somewhere in East London, I believe. So what I would say in relation to the Brexit debate, if the Leave side don't want to be castigated as racists and little Englanders, they shouldn't always castigate the other side as being liberal elitists. Both slurs are unfair and lazy. Nevertheless, as someone who associates myself with the centre, I can definitely see where there is deserved criticism. One of the biggest issues is the issue around political correctness. And this is something that is more associated with the centre than actually the hard left. The hard left can be very intolerant and very aggressive in some of the way they go about things. Yesterday, I came across, just to give it that context, Boston anti-fascism, and it was this nauseating video where this blithering idiot who was wearing a balaclava was attacking white people for criticizing Islam following the London attack. Now, that provoked a lot of angry responses, as you can imagine, because this moron was attacking white people for criticizing Islam, like Islam as a race, also ignoring the fact that there are white Muslim converts who are just as dangerous. But anyway, that's representative of the sort of incredibly narrow thinking of the far left. And there's plenty of examples in the US. Alicia Filarka, sorry, Vet Filarka would be a good example. But sort of awkward, polite political correctness, I think there's something much more associated with the centre. And it's something I think too many third way politicians don't understand. And it isn't, it crosses party lines. You get centrist conservatives, you get centrist Labour people. I mean, Labour's having a real civil war at the moment. It's really one way to look at it because the Blairites, as they're kind of dismissed, are being seen as part of that class, perhaps unfairly, who are completely out of touch. I do think it's somewhat unfair because it gives this idea that they are all kind of living this little Westminster bubble. I'm not sure if that's fair. For a start, many of them have sizable majorities, so the point is their constituents obviously want them, have voted for them. And another point about parliamentary politics that people sometimes forget, it isn't just down to the members, it's down to wider constituents. Like I say, I voted for the Labour MP. I'm not a member of the Labour Party. I voted for her because I felt she's a decent MP. Um, so I feel that tribalism at the moment is really, really going on within the Labour Party. If I was in the Labour Party, I would feel very disillusioned because I would wonder what direction is the party going down. Jeremy Corbyn's school of politics is a disaster. So I sometimes wonder is the best solution for Labour to really break off and form a new party. Those centrist MPs would say, "Why should we? We've just as much a right to be in this party," which would be a fair point. But I don't know what future Labour is going to have. I will say this though about Corbynites and the hard left side of Labour. I sometimes find it hard to understand their thinking because whatever you think of Tony Blair, the fact remains he was electorally the most successful Labour Prime Minister ever, including Clement Attlee. Attlee won 2 elections, Blair won 3. And yet, within Corbynite ranks, he's the devil, basically. I find that quite interesting. That would be almost like conservative activists hating Margaret Thatcher. Doesn't make much sense to me. And it's something I think the Corbyn faction, I do believe they are living in a time warp. I believe they're stuck in the 70s and the 80s in their thinking. Because, and it's just as off putting to me as the populist right now. To get back to where I think there is legitimate criticism of the centre, when you have, for example, I've been very outspoken in my last few videos about the need to talk about Islamism for what it is. Now, the centre has been pathetic in its response. I'm saying that as a centrist. So, those in the sort of polite political establishment, let's say mainstream parties, they will not call radical Islam what it is. And I think that's where the populist right can definitely gain ground. And to be honest, who could blame them? Because that is what is going on. We are seeing a threat from pan Islamism. As a centrist, I sometimes feel the centre lets down its own principles because to me, centrism shouldn't be about being politically correct. It shouldn't be about being polite. It should be about realpolitik. So sometimes I think they get it wrong on this. That's why I, as a centrist, find myself just as angry sometimes with the centre as I am put off by both the populist right and the far left. Now, there will be people watching this who maybe are Trump supporters or Corbyn supporters, will be thinking, if you're frustrated with the centre, why not join us? I'm going to quickly run this down why I don't associate myself with either the hard left or the hard right. The hard left, their answer to everything is that wealth is bad and that wealthy people are evil and that wealth creation is bad in itself. I think they've got it right in terms of, for example, fair treatment of workers, in terms of unemployment rights, these sort of things. I think they have their heart in the right place on those issues. But there are some things, to use a domestic example, Corbyn's Labour, there's certain things I cannot stomach. The the very, very dubious position they have on terrorism, for example, that to me is something I cannot accept. Um, the downplaying of historic communism, I cannot tolerate. Those are things that I really have a problem with. And I just think that they are not looking at reality because that brand of politics, basically pitching class war like the rich are evil, it's, I don't think that is going to be particularly helpful to anyone. Now, where do I have issue with the populist right? Their answer to everything is that immigrants are the problem. That's the impression I get. That is basically their answer to everything, is to blame outsiders. And there, I've said this before in the video where I was discussing where I take issue with the right. Sometimes they just seem callous. There does seem to be a compassion deficit. So when you're demonizing all refugees, I have a problem with that. I don't have a problem with saying, look, there is an issue here with certain refugee groups, especially young men, having regressive attitudes. And we've seen that in Cologne and elsewhere. And I totally get, you know, that argument. But sometimes there is, frankly, an undercurrent of racism in the populist right. And I don't think anyone can rationally deny that. You just have to look at certain forums to see what I'm talking about. Um, and I do think it is important. I've made videos criticizing radical Islam recently. I don't want that to be interpreted as an attack on all Muslims. I'm not saying that to be PC. That's my own position. I don't think that all Muslims are the problem. Um, so there's just areas of the populist right that their drawbridge attitude to things. They have this real protectionist, blood and soil nationalist sort of attitude that I don't think is particularly helpful either. As for Trump, if he's supposed to be the standard bearer of the populist right, well, he's a pretty terrible standard bearer. The man's a compulsive liar. He's utterly paranoid, and he is by definition a demagogue. I mean, you don't have to be politically correct to see that. And there's others who are offering. The other issue I have with both the far left and the hard right is they do say what people want to hear. So in that sense, they're not politically correct. But sometimes that isn't enough. I mean, you could say these, Islamists are taking over our society. It's a valid point because that is their agenda. But when you have, for example, Geert Wilders saying the answer to this is banning all mosques and just banning Islam, it's stupid because it is not workable. That is not an answer to the problem. All that will do is polarize those Muslims who are decent people. It will be giving the Islamists what they want. And it simply isn't practical. I mean, how are you going to get the Dutch police force to inspect if people are practicing Islam or not? It's stupid. Marine Le Pen, I need to study her specific policies closer. Certainly, she's a lot more diplomatic than her father. It's going to be interesting to see what happens in France. I'm going to probably make a specific video about that. Nigel Farage, well, he made all these grand promises about what would happen with Brexit. It would be our Independence Day. And look at what's happened since then. As far as I'm concerned, all we have had is stalemate, uncertainty, and nationalism playing up in Scotland, which is exactly what I felt would happen. I mean, that's not to say that Nigel Farage is responsible for the Scottish nationalists, but it's given them an excuse. And they have made a lot of grand promises. They've presented the EU as this wicked institution. So far, I haven't seen any wonderful benefits from Brexit. I mean, give it time. I want to be optimistic. Well, be optimistic, but it's totally legitimate that people ask questions. Just a point about Brexit, incidentally. get a little bit tired of people saying, "Oh, we won, move on." Um, in a democracy, just because one side loses doesn't mean that side has to shut up. Unlike the Scottish referendum, Brexit was very, very close. In cities like Birmingham, it was wafer thin. So it's absurd saying that one side should simply shut up. I mean, people should accept that 17 million people voted to leave, but we've never been, majority, the tyranny of the majority. I would even say that about Scotland. I've never ever said nationals can't have their opinion. They can have their opinion, but they should accept the result. With Brexit, I say that Remain voters should accept that the result went the way it did, but it's not a case that, because this is going to affect all of us forever. So, of course, there should be ongoing debates. Of course, there should. So, if there is a traction with this video, you'll probably get from this that I'm feeling a little bit disillusioned. I don't really know what the future holds, but I am not prepared to associate myself with either the far left or the populist right. Probably the traction of my videos have been a little bit more to the right because I get so fed up with the political correctness that is within the centre. But when all is said and done, I still believe that centre has the best answers because the populist right and the far left are very good at tapping into what works people up. They're very good at presenting the political establishment as wicked and immoral and all the rest of it. But you have to be very careful with this because if you completely dismiss all of our institutions, government, media, all of it, then you start to get into the realm of conspiracy theories and total disillusionment. That's something I really don't want to, that's not a path I want to go down. So I guess what I'm trying to say is I understand the anger against the centre, and I feel angry sometimes that they don't recognise that, for example, sometimes you have to call a spade a spade. That's something they're not willing to do. I think part of the problem is they are classic politicians. They skirt around answers. They they're overly politically correct on important issues, and I think that's where people get frustrated. But I mean, put it this way: if Trump gets a second term, then the Trump experiment could perhaps be seen as successful. But I would be very surprised if he does. I mean, look at what's happened so far. Only a few weeks ago, he was accusing the British of spying on him. This is a man who's utterly paranoid, far more paranoid than Richard Nixon was. Um, what I would do if I was an elected politician, I would not be politically correct. I would be saying what is on my mind, and I would be speaking out, and I would not be overly sensitive. But nor would I be playing the sort of demagoguery that likes of Trump is. Or on the other side, Jeremy Corbyn, not so much Corbyn himself, but his hardcore far left supporters. I would also be steadfastly defending freedom of expression and condemning those political factions who want to silence it. So I would be outspoken, for example, in condemning far left trying to shut down Mr. Farage. But I would also be outspoken in saying to, let's say, the UKIP faction, you can't tell people to shut up over Brexit. You can't say, just accept it. All of these things, all of these strains of thought come into this. Um, and to be honest, whilst I sometimes find myself mentally being sympathetic to some of the arguments both the populist right and sometimes the hard left make. I mean, I mentioned hard left in terms of unemployment because I am in agreement with Jeremy Corbyn in the way that the welfare system penalises claimants because I've been through it. I know what that's all about. That is one of the very few areas I would probably associate more with quite, the hard left, I suppose. But I'm not prepared to align myself with either school of thought simply because I think they really don't have long term answers. I think in some ways it's been good to have this earthquake politically. because it has kind of woken the centre up. Because perhaps for a long time they were complacent. I still think there's a very long way to go. But what they have to stop doing is endorsing this shackling politically correct approach to things whereby, I mean, you see it from the like Tim Farron of the Liberal Democrats is a very good example. Some would say, think he's hard left. He's actually centre left, but I feel deeply frustrated, for example, when I see Islamist violence going on. All the Liberal Democrats can do is make generic condemnations of terrorism. Any idiot can do that. They should be on the forefront of condemning this ideology, campaigning against this ideology, because it is. I mean, perhaps that's another reason I went against the Liberal Democrats in the end, because to me they were far more to the left than they were classic liberalism, associated with classic liberalism. And actually, that was the party's foundation. They were never the Liberal Party; they were always the Liberal Democrats. So I'm going to round this up. I have no doubt there will be things that people take issue with me in this video. I don't mind people making comments that are refuting anything I've said. One thing I would say though, I don't like when people thumb down my videos and don't bother to say anything. I think that's petty. If you're going to thumb down the video, at least say something. Explain why. Um, and that's simply how I'm feeling. I don't pretend that I know everything. I don't pretend that I'm right about everything. And I have no doubt there'll be some people coming on this video and saying, Nathan, you're wrong about this. You need to think about this. You need to think about that. I'm a grown man. I think things through myself. And I respect other people's opinions insofar as I don't try to impose my own opinion. But likewise, I don't expect people to impose their opinions on me. I believe what I believe. And the thing about political thinking, no one can be robotic. No one can truthfully go through life and not have some evolution of their thoughts. So if I were to really summarize myself right now, it's probably centre right on some issues, centre left on others, and yeah, having pretty hardline views on particular issues. But when all is said and done, I'm a centrist because all my views collectively kind of morph into somewhere in the middle. But it is not about not having strong views. There's things that piss me right off. I just recognize that neither the far left or the hard right really, and I say hard right versus far right because I think there is a bit of a difference between neo Nazis and just real hardcore conservatives. Um, I just think they're very good at tapping into anger. I don't think they're very good at offering the answers. And that's not enough in politics. You have to offer answers as well. And that's where I think the centre has much more weight on their side. But what they have to understand is that people across the board are fed up of this polite sort of establishment politics. I do want to see a lot more passion because then, I'd much, much rather have a politician who came out with bigoted views or came out with very annoying lefty views. At least that way you can see what they're about. I think the reason why people despise political correctness is because it is phony. It's insincere. So I often put myself in this position. If I was a public figure, if I was on a question time panel, I would say we need to fight this Islamist poison. I wouldn't say this terrorist poison. I would say this Islamist poison. Islamic extremism. That is what it is. I would not be shy to criticize militant feminism. I would not be shy to say any of the things I've been saying in these videos. And I do believe a certain degree of diplomacy is required, but yeah, that's probably why people get fed up with the centre because of political correctness. But what I want to say is not all centrists like political correctness. Okay, this has been lengthy, but that's inevitable because of the subject nature. Thank you for watching, and let me know your thoughts. Please keep it respectful, and I don't care what you say, but don't ask me to sort of see your way of thinking. By all means, share your thoughts, disagree with me, but what I don't really like is patronizing comments like, oh, Nathan, you should be this, you should be that. I've had that a few times and, you know, gets a bit tedious. So thank you for watching. Let me know your thoughts.